April 15th, 1912, 2:20 a.m. A father puts his 18-year-old son into a lifeboat and steps back onto the Titanic's deck. George Widener is one of the richest men in America. His son survives. George drowns. Waiting at their 110-room mansion in Pennsylvania is George's father, Peter, who doesn't know yet that his son is dead, that the $50 million in art they were bringing home has sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic, and that the dynasty he built will be destroyed within 3 years. This is Lynnewood Hall, the second largest mansion ever built in America. And the Titanic didn't just sink a ship, it killed this palace and everyone who lived in it. Today, it's abandoned, windows broken, roof collapsed, squatters living in bedrooms that once held millionaires, the largest abandoned mansion in America. And it's still dying, over a century later, filmed by urban explorers on YouTube because the people it was built for drowned before the house ever fulfilled its purpose. Peter Widener started as a butcher's son in Philadelphia. By 1895, he controlled streetcars and railroads in 4 cities, worth $75 million, $2 billion in today's money. Self-made, ruthless, and determined to prove that a bricklayer's grandson could build a dynasty to rival the Vanderbilts and the Astors. In 1895, he purchased 300 acres north of Philadelphia in an area called Elkins Park, where the richest families were building country estates. And he hired architect Horace Trumbauer with simple instructions: build me the greatest house in America, bigger than anything except Biltmore, a palace that will establish the Widener name for generations. Trumbauer delivered plans for a French neoclassical chateau modeled on Versailles, 110 rooms, 3 floors plus basement, steel structural frames so it would never burn, Indiana limestone exterior, marble and mahogany and gilt inside, grand entrance hall rising 2 stories, ballroom for 300 guests, art gallery with walls designed for masterworks, formal gardens, staff quarters for dozens of servants. Construction started in 1897, cost $8 million, $300 million today, took 3 years to build, and when it was finished in 1900, Lynnewood Hall was exactly what Peter wanted. Undeniable proof that he had arrived, that the Widener family belonged among American aristocracy, that his children and grandchildren would inherit not just money, but position, culture, legitimacy. Peter had 3 children who survived to adulthood. George was the oldest, born 1861, 39 years old when Lynnewood Hall was completed. Joseph was younger. Eleanor had married. And Peter's plan was clear. George would inherit the business empire and the house. George's children would inherit after him. A dynasty would continue. The palace would pass through generations, always occupied by Wideners, always the center of family power. But owning a palace wasn't enough. Peter understood that American millionaires were dismissed by European nobility as uncultured, people with money but no taste, no appreciation for beauty beyond price tags. He wanted to prove them wrong. Starting around 100 years ago, Peter and George began traveling to Europe regularly, buying art, Rembrandt paintings, Raphael, Vermeer, sculptures, tapestries from French palaces, rare books. They bought systematically, building a collection that would rival anything in European private hands. By 1912, the Widener collection was valued at $50 million, over $1 billion today, housed in the gallery at Lynnewood Hall, one of the finest private art collections in America. And Peter was 78 years old, increasingly aware he was building this for his children and grandchildren more than for himself. George was 50. George's son Harry was 18, a student at Harvard. 3 generations. The dynasty Peter had worked for. Everything was in place. April 1912. George, his wife Eleanor, and their son Harry traveled to Europe on another art-buying trip. Spent weeks in France and England, attended auctions, met with dealers, bought paintings and sculptures worth millions, arranged for everything to be shipped back to Lynnewood Hall, and booked return passage on a new ship making its maiden voyage, RMS Titanic. First-class accommodations. The Wideners traveling any other way was unthinkable. April 10th, Southampton, England. George, Eleanor, Harry, and Eleanor's maid boarded Titanic. The ship was the largest moving object ever built, the pinnacle of Edwardian luxury. Grand staircase, ornate dining rooms, swimming pool, gymnasium. For the Wideners, who lived in a 110-room mansion, the ship was comfortable, but probably not particularly impressive. They'd seen grander. The voyage was smooth for 4 days. The Wideners socialized with other first-class passengers: John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, the American millionaires who controlled vast portions of the nation's wealth, who knew each other socially and in business, crossing the Atlantic together. April 14th, evening. Eleanor Widener arranged a dinner party in the first-class dining room. Captain Edward Smith tended. Several prominent passengers, multiple courses, fine wines, conversation about business and art and the concerns of people for whom money was never a concern. The dinner ended around 10 p.m. The Wideners returned to their suite. Harry stayed up reading. Their parents went to bed. At 11:40 p.m., Titanic struck an iceberg. Many passengers didn't realize anything serious had happened. The collision was almost gentle, but the iceberg had opened the hull across 5 compartments. Water was flooding in. Titanic could survive flooding in 4 compartments, but not 5. Titanic was going to sink. There weren't enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. Most of the 2,200 people on the ship were going to die in the next 2 hours. George and Eleanor understood quickly. Crew was loading women and children into lifeboats first, enforcing the protocol strictly in some areas, less so in others. Eleanor got into lifeboat 4. Harry got in, 18 years old, and the officers were allowing some teenage boys aboard with their mothers. George stayed on deck. We don't know what George said to Harry in those final moments. No one recorded it. But picture this: father and son, one in the lifeboat, one on the deck of a sinking ship. George could have probably gotten into a boat if he'd pushed, if he'd abandoned the social code that said first-class men stayed behind while women and children were saved. But he didn't. He put his son in the boat, stepped back, and that was the last time Harry saw his father alive. Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912. The ship broke apart and went down in waters so cold that most people who entered it died within 15 minutes. George Widener drowned. His body was never recovered. Approximately 1,500 people died that night. Eleanor survived. Harry survived. Eleanor's maid survived. But George was gone, and the art they'd been excited to bring home was at the bottom of the Atlantic, and the dynasty he'd built will be destroyed within 3 years. Peter was 78, at first on flight radio that none of the survivors knew anything about his father. Peter Widener was at Lynnewood Hall when news arrived that Titanic had sunk, that George was missing, that Eleanor and Harry had survived. Then confirmation: George was dead. Picture Peter getting that news. 78 years old, spent his entire life building wealth and position, constructed Lynnewood Hall specifically as the center of his dynasty. His son George was supposed to take over the business empire. His grandson Harry was supposed to inherit after him. Generations of Wideners in the 110-room mansion, the family name growing in influence and importance.
And now George was dead, drowned in the Atlantic, body never recovered. The art collection they'd been assembling was lost, and Peter was left with his traumatized 18-year-old grandson, a mansion designed for a dynasty that had just died, and 3 years left to live. Peter walked through Lynnewood Hall that day, 110 rooms, ballrooms designed for entertaining, guest suites for visitors, dining halls for family gatherings, an art gallery for the collection that would establish Widener cultural credentials for generations. All of it built on the assumption that the family would continue, that George would take over, that Harry would follow, that the palace would shelter multiple generations, proving the dynasty was permanent. But George was dead, and everything Peter had built, the businesses, the fortune, the palace, the art collection, the dynasty itself, was suddenly revealed as fragile, as dependent on George's survival, as one disaster away from collapse. Harry came back from the Titanic broken, 18 years old, Harvard student, heir to $75 million, and he'd watched his father put him in a lifeboat and step back and drown. The survival wasn't triumph, it was guilt. Every day after was lived with the knowledge that he was alive because his father died, that he'd taken the spot that could have saved George. People told him he was lucky, told him he had his whole life ahead, told him his grandfather needed him to be strong, to be the heir the dynasty required. And Harry tried, went back to Harvard, tried to focus on studies, tried to pretend everything was fine. But nothing was fine. His father was dead. His grandfather was dying from grief, and waiting in Pennsylvania was a 110-room palace Harry was supposed to want, supposed to treasure, supposed to see as his inheritance and his future. Instead, he saw it as a tomb. Peter lasted 3 years. 3 years of going through motions, managing businesses he no longer cared about, living in a house too large for grief. He'd built Lynnewood Hall for family gatherings, for multiple generations, for the social performance of dynasty. Instead, he had Hannah, his wife, also destroyed by losing their son. Eleanor visited occasionally, but couldn't bear to stay. Harry was traumatized and withdrawn. Joseph, Peter's other son, visited with his family, but didn't live there. The house that was supposed to demonstrate Widener permanence instead demonstrated how impermanent everything was, how quickly a dynasty could collapse, how a single disaster could reveal that all the marble and limestone and carefully curated art couldn't protect you from the fundamental fragility of human life. The art collection, the paintings and sculptures Peter and George had spent 15 years acquiring, that were supposed to establish the family's cultural legitimacy for generations, became evidence of what was lost. Every piece they'd bought together was a reminder of George, of trips to Europe, of the final trip that killed him. Peter couldn't look at the collection without thinking about his son, couldn't walk through the gallery without remembering George standing beside him, discussing acquisitions, planning displays, excited about building something permanent together. And the palace itself was revealed as absurd. 110 rooms for a broken family. Ballrooms no one used, guest suites no one occupied, dining rooms too large for the people who remained. Staff maintained everything perfectly, but the house was fundamentally dead, a stage without performers, a palace without purpose. Peter stopped entertaining, stopped hosting, stopped doing any of the things the house was designed for. Lynnewood Hall became a mausoleum, beautiful and perfectly maintained, but lifeless, a monument to the dynasty that had died before it could really begin. Peter Widener died on November 6, 1915, at Lynnewood Hall, 81 years old. Official cause, complications from a fall. But everyone who knew him understood he died of grief, that losing George had broken something fundamental. The 3 years after the Titanic had just been the slow process of that break becoming complete. He died in the house he'd built to establish his dynasty, surrounded by art he'd collected to prove his legitimacy, having outlived the son who was supposed to inherit everything. His funeral was held at Lynnewood Hall, in the grand entrance hall where he'd welcomed guests when George was alive, when the future seemed secure. Now that hall was filled with mourners acknowledging the end of what Peter had tried to build. The will divided the fortune. Eleanor, as George's widow, inherited George's share, plus Lynnewood Hall itself. Harry inherited massive wealth, but not the house. That went to his mother. Joseph received his share, and the art collection, worth over $50 million, was supposed to go to George, so it went to Eleanor and Harry. Eleanor couldn't keep it. The insurance costs alone were prohibitive. The responsibility of securing that much valuable art in a private residence was overwhelming, and every painting reminded her of George, of the trips they'd taken together, of the final trip that killed him. She began donating the collection almost immediately. The Widener collection at the National Gallery in Washington received Vermeers, Rembrandts, Raphaels, masterworks now among the most important pieces in American museums. The Metropolitan Museum in New York received sculpture. The Philadelphia Museum of Art received paintings and furniture. Within 5 years, the art collection that was supposed to define the Widener dynasty forever had been dispersed to public institutions. The family name attached to museum galleries instead of Lynnewood Hall. The cultural legacy Peter wanted preserved in his palace, instead preserved in places where millions of strangers would see it, but where it would never return to the house it was bought for. And Harry tried to live at Lynnewood Hall. His mother owned it legally, but didn't want to occupy it. So Harry, at 21 years old, traumatized and unprepared, tried to maintain a 110-room palace as a residence for a single young man. Picture this. Harry Widener, age 21, eating dinner alone in a dining room built for 40 people. One plate on a table that seats 20, servants standing in doorways waiting for instructions, 70 empty rooms above him. The ballroom where his grandfather imagined hosting Philadelphia society hasn't been used in years. The art gallery is empty, everything donated to museums. The guest suites are closed off, heat turned off in winter to save costs. Harry is paying hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, millions in today's money, for a house he doesn't want, for a family that doesn't exist because of a dynasty that died on the Titanic. He kept trying, kept minimal staff, closed off sections of the house, lived in a fraction of the space, but the absurdity was crushing, and the house was a constant reminder of everything he'd lost: his father, his grandfather, the future that was supposed to be his, the dynasty that was supposed to give his life meaning and purpose.
Harry married in 1919 Eleanor Elkins, daughter of another wealthy Philadelphia family. The marriage was partly about trying to create the life Peter had envisioned. Young Widener heir marries appropriate woman, starts family, fills Lynnewood Hall with the next generation, continues the dynasty. But Eleanor Elkins Widener didn't want to live at Lynnewood Hall any more than Harry did. The house was oppressive, haunted not by ghosts, but by expectations, by the knowledge that every room represented Peter's dream of permanence, and that dream was dead. They lived there occasionally, but spent most of their time elsewhere. New York, Europe, anywhere but the Pennsylvania palace that was supposed to be Harry's inheritance, but felt like his prison. The 1920s were a decade of managed decline. Harry and Eleanor had no children. Whether by choice or circumstance, the result was the same. No third generation to inherit Lynnewood Hall. No grandchildren to fill the rooms. No future Wideners to justify the existence of a dynastic palace. The house required constant, expensive maintenance. Roofs leaked, heating systems failed, plumbing broke, paint peeled. Every year, the cost of maintaining Lynnewood Hall exceeded any possible use Harry got from it. He was spending a fortune to preserve a house he didn't want, for a family that didn't exist, because of obligations inherited from a grandfather who died believing the dynasty would last forever. The Great Depression hit in 1929. Suddenly, maintaining a 110-room mansion seemed obscene. Unemployment was massive. People were starving, families losing homes, and Harry Widener was spending enormous sums keeping a palace heated that he barely lived in. The social context that had made houses like Lynnewood Hall impressive had evaporated. These Gilded Age palaces now looked like monuments to inequality, to the excesses that had led to economic collapse. Harry died in 1937, 43 years old. Official cause, heart failure. But those who knew him understood he'd been dying slowly since the Titanic. He'd never recovered from the trauma. His entire adult life had been shaped by survivor's guilt and by the burden of maintaining what his grandfather built while knowing it was pointless, that the dynasty had died with George. Harry left no children. He'd been the last direct male heir in Peter's line. With Harry's death, that branch of the Widener family ended. 25 years after the Titanic, the dynasty Peter had tried to build lasted exactly one generation past Peter's death. Lynnewood Hall passed to Harry's widow, Eleanor, and Eleanor, who had never wanted the house, who had spent decades avoiding it, now found herself sole owner of America's second-largest private residence. She was 53, wealthy but not wealthy enough to justify maintaining 110 rooms indefinitely, and she had no children to inherit it, no reason to preserve it except obligation to her dead husband's dead grandfather's dream. She tried to donate it, offered it to universities, to the government, to organizations that might use it as museum or school, but no one wanted it. Operating costs were too high. The building was too specific. Converting it to institutional use would cost millions on top of ongoing maintenance expenses. Lynnewood Hall had become unsellable, undonatable, a burden Eleanor was stuck with because no one else would take it even for free. In 1942, exactly 30 years after the Titanic sank, Eleanor finally found a buyer. Faith Theological Seminary purchased Lynnewood Hall for $102,000. Less than 2% of what it cost to build. The seminary's plan was simple: convert bedrooms into dormitories, reception rooms into classrooms, the ballroom into a chapel. Use Peter Widener's monument to dynasty as a place to train ministers. It lasted 20 years before they gave up. The problem wasn't the building's size or layout. The problem was that Lynnewood Hall was designed to be maintained by an army of servants, paid for by a multi-million-dollar fortune, with heating bills and roof repairs and plumbing maintenance funded by railroad and utility income that generated money constantly. Take away that funding, and the building becomes a beast that consumes whoever owns it.
Roofs leak, heating systems fail, plumbing break. 110 rooms means 110 rooms of problems. And the seminary didn't have Widener money, didn't have any serious money. Had just enough to buy the building, then discovered they'd bought something that was going to bankrupt them through maintenance costs alone.
Water started leaking through the roof within a few years. The seminary couldn't afford repairs. A roof on a structure this massive costs hundreds of thousands to fix properly. So they patched it, and the patches failed, and water kept entering, damaged ceilings and walls, stained the mahogany woodwork, caused plaster to crack and fall. Paint peeled, marble absorbed moisture and began deteriorating. The building that Peter Widener had insisted be constructed with the finest materials, with steel frame and Indiana limestone specifically so it would last forever, started dying the moment the money to maintain it disappeared. By 1959, the seminary was done. They put Lynnewood Hall up for sale. A developer bought it with plans to demolish the mansion and build houses on the 11 acres. Lynnewood Park had become a desirable suburb. The land was worth far more than the building. Demolition made financial sense. But local preservation groups fought back. Lynnewood Hall was historically significant, they argued. Architectural masterpiece, one of the finest examples of Beaux Arts design in America. It should be preserved, not destroyed. The developer faced public pressure, negative press, and the realization that demolishing a structure this massive, steel frame, limestone walls, built to withstand centuries, would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, almost as expensive as renovating it. So the developer backed down, kept the building, listed it for sale at prices no one would pay. And while it sat empty waiting for a buyer who never came, Lynnewood Hall deteriorated faster than it had under the seminary, because at least the seminary had kept basic maintenance going, had tried to prevent catastrophic decay. Now there was nothing. No heat in winter, no one fixing leaks, no one securing windows. The mansion was dying of neglect. Vandals discovered it first, broke windows to get inside, stole anything removable, copper pipes, bronze fixtures, mahogany woodwork, marble mantels. Anything that could be sold for scrap was torn out and hauled away. The grand entrance hall that had hosted Peter Widener's funeral was stripped of decorative elements. The ballroom, where he'd imagined entertaining Philadelphia society, had its chandeliers stolen. The bedrooms where the Wideners had slept had their copper plumbing ripped from the walls. Then water entered through broken windows and roof leaks, froze in winter. Ice expands, cracks stone and plaster, destroys from inside. Every winter caused more damage. Every spring revealed more destruction. Portions of the roof collapsed, exposing entire rooms to weather. Ceilings fell, floors rotted. The mahogany woodwork that cost a fortune to install warped and cracked. The marble staircases absorbed water and began crumbling at the edges. The 1970s brought new development proposals: convert it to luxury condominiums, make it a hotel, use it as a corporate retreat center. Every plan failed for the same reason. The cost of renovation exceeded any possible return. To bring 110 rooms up to modern building code meant new electrical throughout, new plumbing, new heating and cooling, structural repairs, roof replacement. Estimates ran into tens of millions. And even after spending that money, what would you have? A 110-room building in suburban Pennsylvania, too large for a private residence, too small for a commercial hotel, too expensive to operate as a museum, too isolated to attract visitor traffic that would justify the expense. Lynnewood Hall changed hands repeatedly through the 1980s and 1990s. Each new owner had grand plans. Each plan died during the due diligence phase, when engineers inspected the property and revealed the extent of damage, the cost of repairs, the impossibility of making the economics work. So the building sat, empty, deteriorating, windows broken, roof collapsing, weather entering freely, pigeons and rats nesting inside, homeless people sheltering in former bedrooms during winter. The palace Peter Widener built to demonstrate his dynasty becoming a squat, a ruin, a place where people with nothing lived in rooms designed for millionaires. Go on YouTube right now, search Lynnewood Hall, Urbex. You'll find dozens of videos from urban explorers who've illegally entered the property to film what remains. Watch what's left. The grand entrance hall where Peter Widener welcomed guests in 1900, portions of the ceiling have collapsed. You can see sky through holes in the roof. Rain pours directly onto the marble floor during storms.
The limestone walls are water-stained, graffiti covers surfaces. The coffered ceiling, which cost tens of thousands to install, is crumbling. Pieces fall into the floor and left where they landed. The grand staircase? Still there. Mahogany balustrade weathered and damaged. Marble steps chipped and broken. The carpet is long gone. The bronze fixtures were stolen decades ago, but you can still see what it was, still recognize the sweep of the stairs, the grandeur of the design. It's just dying now, slowly, exposed to weather and time. The ballroom where Peter imagined hosting 300 guests, the ceiling is stained brown from water damage. Paint peels in enormous sheets. The floor is covered in debris, fallen plaster, broken wood, pigeon droppings, garbage left by squatters. The enormous windows are mostly broken. Wind and rain enter freely. Pigeons nest in the rafters. The room that was supposed to be the social center of Widener dynasty is a shell, stripped of everything valuable, serving as shelter for birds and homeless people. The art gallery designed to display $50 million in Rembrandts and Vermeers, empty. Walls water-stained and covered in graffiti. The special lighting Peter installed is gone. The climate control that preserved paintings is gone. The gallery is just a large empty room now, notable only because you can see on the walls where paintings once hung, cleaner rectangles in the grime showing where frames protected the surface for decades before the collection was donated to museums. The bedrooms where George and Eleanor Widener slept, where Harry grew up, where Peter died. Some are relatively intact. You can still see mahogany built-ins, marble fireplaces, ornate plasterwork. Others are completely destroyed. Ceilings collapsed, floors rotted through, walls crumbling. Squatters have lived in these rooms, built fires in fireplaces that cost $10,000 each to install, left garbage and graffiti. Urban explorers film themselves walking through, commenting on the decay, touching walls that millionaires once touched, standing in spaces that were supposed to last forever. In 2014, a developer named Richard purchased Lynnewood Hall, announced plans to convert it to luxury condominiums, 40 units, prices starting at $1 million each. Renderings showed beautifully restored spaces, the grand entrance hall gleaming with new marble, the ballroom converted to an event space, individual condo units in former bedrooms with modern amenities and preserved architectural details. The project was featured in newspapers. Architectural blogs wrote about it. Preservationists celebrated that finally someone was going to save Lynnewood Hall.
But the renovation never started. Engineers inspected the property and kept finding more problems. The roof damage was worse than initial estimates. The water damage was more extensive. The structural frame needed work. Asbestos had to be removed. Lead paint abatement was required. Electrical and plumbing would have to be completely replaced. Heating and cooling systems installed from scratch. The cost estimates kept climbing. $30 million, $40 million, $50 million. And that was just to make it habitable, before any luxury finishes or the architectural restoration that would justify million-dollar condo prices. Financing fell apart. The economics didn't work. The market for luxury condos in that location was uncertain. Who would pay $1 million for a condo in a building that was famous primarily for being abandoned, for being the place where a dynasty died, for being a monument to failure? The project stalled, then died. Yoon still legally owns Lynnewood Hall as of 2024, but no work is being done. The building continues to deteriorate. More of the roof has collapsed. More rooms have been destroyed by water. More vandalism has occurred. The palace is dying faster now than at any point in its history. And preservation groups keep fighting. Keep arguing that Lynnewood Hall is too important to lose, that it represents American history, Gilded Age architecture, the ambitions and failures of an entire era. They're probably right. The building is historically significant, architecturally important, one of the finest examples of Beaux Arts residential design still standing in America. But historical significance doesn't pay for roof repairs. Architectural importance doesn't fund structural stabilization. The estimated cost to fully restore Lynnewood Hall now exceeds $60 million. That's just to restore. Doesn't include the ongoing operational costs of actually using a 110-room building for anything. No government agency has that money available. No private foundation wants to commit to that expense. No developer can make the numbers work. So Lynnewood Hall sits,
and decays, and gets filmed by urban explorers, and remains listed for sale at prices no one will pay, and continues to be the subject of plans that never materialize. The Titanic sank 112 years ago. George Widener drowned in 1912. Peter died of grief in 1915. Harry died traumatized and childless. The family line ended. The art collection was donated to museums. The fortune was divided among descendants until no single heir had enough to maintain a palace. And Lynnewood Hall, the physical manifestation of Peter's ambitions, became a burden that everyone wanted to escape. A property that couldn't be sold or donated or demolished economically. A ruin that refuses to die completely, but that no one can save. The Titanic didn't just kill 1,500 people, it destroyed futures. George Widener was supposed to run the family empire for decades. Harry was supposed to inherit after him. The dynasty was supposed to continue through multiple generations. The palace was supposed to shelter them all. Instead, the Titanic killed George, and George's death killed everything else. Peter's will to live, Harry's ability to function, the family's capacity to maintain their palace, the dynasty's future. And Lynnewood Hall stands as the physical evidence of that destruction. A 110-room palace dying slowly because the people it was built for died too soon. Because the dynasty ended before the dynasty began. Because Peter Widener built something meant to last forever, and the forever he imagined lasted barely 40 decades before collapsing completely. The mansion will probably stand for decades more, deteriorating further, roof collapsing in more areas, more rooms destroyed by weather, more vandalism, more failed development plans, more preservation groups arguing it should be saved while no one actually saves it. Eventually, perhaps, someone will finally demolish it, or it will collapse on its own, room by room, year by year, until nothing remains but the foundation and some crumbling limestone walls. And when it's finally gone, what will be left? Museum collections with Widener name on gallery labels commemorating art that was supposed to stay in the palace? Historical records of a family that rose from nothing and returned to nothing in 3 generations? YouTube videos of urban explorers filming decay? Photographs of what Lynnewood Hall looked like when it was new, when Peter's dream still seemed possible, when the mansion represented success instead of failure? The Titanic destroyed this mansion, not by sinking it, not by physically damaging it, but by killing the people it was built for, by ending the dynasty before the dynasty could fulfill its purpose, by revealing that all of Peter's careful planning and massive spending and obsessive attention to quality couldn't protect what he built from the fundamental randomness of disaster, from the iceberg that appeared in the North Atlantic on April 14, 1912, from the father who put his son in a lifeboat and stepped back and drowned. Lynnewood Hall was built to shelter generations of Wideners. It sheltered them for 42 years, and then it outlived them and kept standing and became instead a monument to everything Peter didn't understand when he was building it, that dynasties are fragile, that success is temporary, that you cannot build permanence no matter how much money you spend, or how well you construct the walls, or how carefully you plan for futures that will never come. The mansion is still there in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, still dying, still filmed by urban explorers, still the subject of failed development plans, still standing as proof that Peter Widener's greatest achievement, this mansion meant to last forever, has lasted primarily as evidence of his failure, as a monument to the dynasty that ended almost immediately after he died, as the largest abandoned mansion in America, dying slowly because everyone who was supposed to inherit it is gone, because the Titanic didn't just sink a ship, but destroyed a family and a future and a dream that was built in limestone and marble, but couldn't survive the death of one man in the cold North Atlantic. If this story changed how you see wealth and legacy, subscribe to Old Money Era for more stories of palaces built to last forever that didn't. Comment, should Lynnewood Hall be saved or demolished?